Sarah Martinez never imagined that a routine training demonstration would become the most talked-about moment in Navy SEAL history. Standing in front of 282 elite warriors, she was just another instructor trying to prove that size doesn't matter when skill meets determination. But when two overconfident SEALs decided to test her limits with a coordinated attack they called a double kick, they had no idea they were about to witness something that would be whispered about in military circles for decades to come. What happened next lasted only 17 seconds, but those 17 seconds would shatter more than just bones. They would break down barriers, challenge assumptions, and prove that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. This is the true story of how one woman's lightning-fast response to disrespect became a legend that spread far beyond the walls of Coronado Naval Base. The crowd fell silent, the medics were called, and Sarah Martinez became the woman who reminded 282 Navy SEALs that respect isn't given based on size, it's earned through action. Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls growing up in East Los Angeles. While her friends spent afternoons at the mall or watching television, she was in her grandfather's garage, learning to fix cars and throw punches with equal precision. Her grandfather, Miguel, was a former boxer who had fought in underground rings during the 1960s. He saw something special in Sarah's eyes, a fire that reminded him of his younger self. "Strength isn't about how big your muscles are, mija," Miguel would tell her as they worked on old engines together. "It's about how fast your mind moves and how precise your actions are." These words would echo in Sarah's mind for years to come, shaping not just her fighting style, but her entire approach to life. By the time Sarah turned 18, she had already earned black belts in 3 different martial arts: Taekwondo, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Krav Maga. Her instructors were amazed by her natural ability to read opponents and react with surgical precision. She wasn't the strongest fighter in any gym, but she was consistently the smartest. While others relied on brute force, Sarah developed a style that was all about timing, leverage, and exploiting weaknesses. After high school, Sarah joined the Marine Corps, where she quickly distinguished herself as an exceptional hand-to-hand combat instructor. Her superiors noticed that recruits under her training showed remarkable improvement in close-quarters combat situations. She had a gift for breaking down complex fighting techniques into simple, teachable moments. More importantly, she could make even the most skeptical recruit believe they could defend themselves against much larger opponents. During her 8 years in the Marines, Sarah earned numerous commendations and developed a reputation as one of the most effective combat trainers in the service. Her methods were unconventional but undeniably successful. She didn't just teach techniques, she taught confidence, strategy, and the mental aspects of combat that many instructors overlooked. When Sarah left the Marines in 2018, she had multiple job offers from various military contractors and law enforcement agencies. However, the opportunity that intrigued her most came from an unexpected source: the Navy SEAL Training Command at Coronado Naval Base in California. They wanted her to develop and implement new hand-to-hand combat curricula for their elite forces. The offer was both exciting and daunting. Navy SEALs were legendary for their physical prowess and mental toughness. They were also notoriously skeptical of outsiders, especially civilian contractors who hadn't earned their trident. Sarah knew that walking into their world as a 5'4" Latina woman would present unique challenges, but she had never backed down from a challenge in her life. Her first day at Coronado was exactly what she expected. The looks, the whispered comments, the obvious skepticism from both instructors and trainees. She had prepared for this reaction, knowing that respect in the military was earned through demonstration, not credentials. Her plan was simple: let her skills speak for themselves. Commander David Richardson, the officer who had hired her, gave Sarah a tour of the facilities and introduced her to key personnel. Richardson was a fair man who believed in merit over politics, but even he seemed nervous about how the SEALs would receive their new instructor. "They're good men," Richardson explained as they walked through the training compound, "but they can be protective of their traditions. Some of them might take time to warm up to new approaches." Sarah appreciated his diplomatic way of saying that some SEALs might not immediately respect a female civilian contractor. She had dealt with similar situations throughout her military career, and had learned that the best response was always professional excellence. The first few weeks went smoothly enough. Sarah observed existing training methods, studied the SEALs' current hand-to-hand combat curriculum, and began developing her recommendations for improvements. She kept a low profile, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions rather than immediately trying to implement changes. During this observation period, Sarah noticed several areas where the current training could be enhanced. The SEALs were incredibly fit and naturally aggressive fighters, But their hand-to-hand combat training focused heavily on strength and endurance rather than technique and strategy. They were essentially trying to overpower every opponent, which worked well when they had size and strength advantages but could be problematic in other scenarios. Sarah's background taught her that real combat was unpredictable. Opponents might be larger, stronger, armed, or fighting in groups. The most effective fighting systems were those that worked regardless of physical disparities. She began developing a presentation that would demonstrate these principles to the SEALs. 3 weeks into her contract, Commander Richardson announced that Sarah would be giving a demonstration to a large group of SEALs from multiple teams. The timing coincided with a quarterly training assembly, meaning there would be nearly 300 elite operators in attendance. It would be Sarah's formal introduction to the SEAL community and her opportunity to establish credibility. As the date approached, Sarah could sense increasing curiosity and skepticism among the SEALs. She overheard conversations in hallways, saw the looks in the mess hall, and felt the weight of expectation building. Some SEALs seemed genuinely interested in what she might teach them, while others appeared to view the demonstration as entertainment rather than education. The night before her presentation, Sarah called her grandfather Miguel, now in his 70s but still sharp as ever. She told him about the demonstration and admitted that she felt more nervous than she had in years. "Why are you nervous, mija?" Miguel asked in his gentle but direct way. "There's going to be almost 300 of them," Sarah explained. "These are the best of the best, and they're expecting me to teach them something they don't already know." Miguel chuckled softly. "And what did I always tell you about fighting multiple opponents?" Sarah smiled despite her nerves. "That it doesn't matter how many there are, if you're faster and smarter than they expect." "Exactly. Tomorrow, you're not fighting 300 men, you're teaching them. And teaching is just another kind of fighting. You use your mind to overcome their assumptions." That conversation helped Sarah refocus on her strengths. She wasn't trying to prove she was stronger than Navy SEALs. She was trying to show them techniques that would make them even more effective than they already were. Her job was to add to their arsenal, not compete with their existing skills. The morning of the demonstration arrived with typical San Diego sunshine. Sarah arrived early to set up the training area and review her notes one final time. She had planned a presentation that would combine explanation with practical demonstration, showing how technique could overcome size and strength disadvantages. As SEALs began filing into the large training gymnasium, Sarah felt the familiar pre-performance energy that she remembered from her competitive martial arts days. The room filled with quiet conversation and the sound of boots on mats. She looked out at the sea of faces, all male, all intensely focused, all waiting to see what the civilian contractor thought she could teach them. Commander Richardson introduced Sarah with appropriate credentials and emphasized that the demonstration was part of ongoing efforts to enhance SEAL training capabilities. His tone was professional and supportive, but Sarah could tell he was also nervous about how this would go. Sarah stepped to the center of the mat and looked out at 282 of America's most elite warriors. In that moment, she felt a calm settle over her that she recognized from countless competitive fights and military training exercises. This was her element, the moment when preparation met opportunity. Sarah began her presentation with confidence, explaining the principles behind effective hand-to-hand combat that didn't rely solely on size and strength. She talked about leverage, timing, and reading an opponent's intentions through body language. The SEALs listened attentively, though she could sense varying levels of skepticism throughout the room. "The biggest mistake any fighter can make," Sarah explained, "is assuming that physical advantages guarantee victory. In real combat situations, you might face opponents who are larger, stronger, or even multiple attackers. The techniques I'm going to show you today are designed to work regardless of those disadvantages." She had prepared several demonstration sequences that would illustrate her points practically. The first involved basic redirection techniques, showing how to use an attacker's momentum against them. Sarah called for volunteers and was pleased when several SEALs stepped forward eagerly. The first volunteer was Petty Officer James Chen, a compact but muscular operator who approached the demonstration with genuine curiosity. Sarah walked him through a basic attack scenario and then demonstrated how proper positioning and timing could neutralize his advance without requiring significant strength. The demonstration went smoothly. Chen played his part well, attacking with enough intensity to make the techniques look realistic while allowing Sarah to execute them safely. The watching SEALs nodded appreciatively as they saw how physics and technique could overcome raw power. "The key," Sarah explained as she reset for the next demonstration, "is not to meet force with force, but to redirect that force in directions your opponent can't control." She called for another volunteer and continued with increasingly complex scenarios. As the demonstration progressed, Sarah noticed that most of the SEALs were genuinely engaged with the material. They asked intelligent questions about application in different scenarios and seemed to appreciate the tactical thinking behind her methods. However, she also noticed a small group near the back who seemed less impressed. This group was led by two SEALs who had been whispering to each other throughout the presentation. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb and Petty Officer Second Class Tyler Rodriguez were both large, physically imposing men who had reputations as exceptional fighters within their teams. Webb in particular was known for his aggressive fighting style and had never lost a sparring match within his unit. During a brief break in the presentation, Sarah overheard fragments of their conversation. They seemed to be questioning whether her techniques would work against real opponents who weren't cooperating with the demonstration. She had encountered this type of skepticism before and knew it often stemmed from ego rather than genuine concern about effectiveness. Sarah decided to address this skepticism directly. "I know some of you might be wondering whether these techniques work against opponents who aren't cooperating," she said, looking directly toward Webb and Rodriguez. "That's a fair question, and I'm happy to demonstrate with anyone who wants to test them for real." The gymnasium fell silent. This was exactly the kind of challenge that SEALs respected: direct, honest, and confidence backed by willingness to prove it. Several hands went up, including Webb's and Rodriguez's. Sarah chose Webb first, partly because she could sense he was the most skeptical, and partly because she knew that convincing him would go a long way toward convincing others. Webb was about 6'2" inches, and probably weighed close to 220 pounds, making him nearly a foot taller and at least 70 pounds heavier than Sarah. "What would you like to try?" Sarah asked as Webb stepped onto the mat. "How about we start simple?" Webb replied with a slight smirk. "Basic takedown. I try to grab you and take you down, you try to stop me." Sarah nodded. "Sounds fair. Full speed, full intensity?" Webb's smirk widened. "If you're sure you can handle it." The other SEALs formed a loose circle around them, sensing that this demonstration was about to become much more interesting. Commander Richardson looked nervous but didn't intervene. He knew that credibility in this environment had to be earned through action. Webb approached the engagement with typical SEAL confidence. He had size, strength, training, and experience on his side. In his mind, this would be a quick demonstration of why physical advantages mattered in real combat. He planned to grab Sarah, take her down efficiently but safely, and prove his point about the limitations of technique versus strength. What Webb didn't account for was Sarah's years of experience fighting larger opponents. She had developed her entire fighting style around the assumption that she would usually be smaller and weaker than her adversaries. Every technique she knew was designed specifically to work against bigger, stronger opponents. As Webb moved in for his takedown attempt, Sarah seemed to barely move. She made a small step to her left, rotated her hips slightly, and suddenly Webb found himself flying through the air. He landed hard on his back with Sarah controlling his arm in a position that would have resulted in a break if she had applied full pressure. The gymnasium erupted in surprised exclamations. Webb looked stunned, both by the speed of the technique and by how effortlessly it had been executed. He had been taken down so quickly that he wasn't entirely sure what had happened. Sarah helped him to his feet and explained the technique to the watching SEALs. The key is not to resist his forward momentum, but to redirect it. When he commits to the takedown, his balance shifts in a predictable way. If you know how to read that shift and react to it, you can use his own energy against him. Webb, to his credit, was a good sport about being outmaneuvered. "Can we try that again?" he asked. "I'd like to see if I can counter it." They repeated the engagement several times, with Sarah varying her responses to show different applications of the same principles. Each time, Webb found himself controlled or taken down despite his size and strength advantages. The watching SEALs were clearly impressed, and Sarah could sense that she was winning their respect. However, Rodriguez seemed less convinced than the others. Where Webb had accepted his defeats gracefully and seemed genuinely interested in learning the techniques, Rodriguez appeared increasingly frustrated. Sarah recognized the signs. He was taking the demonstrations personally rather than viewing them as educational opportunities. After the fifth or sixth repetition with Webb, Rodriguez called out from the crowd, "That's all well and good against one opponent, but what about multiple attackers? That's more realistic anyway." Sarah paused and looked at him carefully. Multiple opponent scenarios were certainly part of her training repertoire, but they were significantly more dangerous to demonstrate, especially with operators who might let ego override safety considerations. "Multiple opponent scenarios are definitely important," Sarah replied diplomatically. "However, they require careful control to demonstrate safely. I'd be happy to walk through the principles and maybe show some basic applications. Walk through the principles? Rodriguez scoffed. Come on, if these techniques really work, they should work against multiple opponents. Webb and I could attack together. Just basic stuff, nothing crazy. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could sense the mood in the room shifting. Some SEALs seemed interested in seeing how she would handle multiple opponents, while others looked concerned about the safety implications. Commander Richardson started to step forward, clearly planning to intervene. Sarah held up a hand to stop Richardson and considered her options. She could decline the challenge, which would be the safe choice, but might undermine the credibility she had just established. Or she could accept it, knowing that Rodriguez's attitude suggested he might not prioritize safety over proving his point. If we do this, Sarah said finally, we need to establish clear boundaries, basic attacks only, controlled intensity, and everyone stops immediately if I say stop or if anyone gets hurt. Rodriguez nodded eagerly. Absolutely. Just want to see how the techniques work in a more realistic scenario. Webb looked less enthusiastic about the idea, but seemed willing to participate if Sarah agreed to it. He had already experienced her skill level and had developed a healthy respect for her abilities. Sarah studied both men carefully. Webb she trusted to maintain control and follow the agreed-upon rules. Rodriguez was the wild card. His body language suggested that he was more interested in proving a point than in learning techniques. Against her better judgment, Sarah nodded. All right, but we start very slowly and build up intensity only if everyone stays in control. The two SEALs positioned themselves on opposite sides of Sarah, approximately 6 feet away. The watching crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were about to witness something special. Commander Richardson looked like he wanted to stop the demonstration, but recognized that intervening now would undermine Sarah's authority completely. What happened next would be talked about at Coronado for years to come. The initial exchanges went exactly as Sarah had planned. Webb and Rodriguez approached from different angles with basic grabbing attempts, and she demonstrated how to use positioning and timing to avoid being caught between multiple attackers. The key, she explained, was constant movement and never allowing multiple opponents to coordinate their attacks effectively. For the first few minutes, both SEALs followed the agreed-upon rules. They attacked with controlled intensity, allowing Sarah to demonstrate various defensive techniques while explaining the principles behind each movement. The watching crowd was clearly impressed with how she managed to stay ahead of both attackers despite being significantly outnumbered in terms of size and strength. However, Sarah began to notice that Rodriguez was gradually increasing his intensity level. What started as controlled demonstration attacks were becoming more aggressive and less predictable. During one exchange, he grabbed at her with enough force that she had to use a more severe counter technique than she had planned, resulting in him being thrown harder than was necessary for demonstration purposes. Everything okay? Sarah asked as Rodriguez got back to his feet, brushing off his uniform. Yeah, I'm good, he replied, but his tone had an edge that hadn't been there before. Just want to make sure we're testing these techniques properly. Webb, who had been participating professionally throughout the demonstration, looked uncomfortable with his partner's escalating aggression. During a brief pause, he approached Rodriguez and had a quiet conversation that Sarah couldn't hear but could read through body language. Webb was clearly counseling his teammate to dial back the intensity. Sarah decided to wrap up the multiple opponent demonstration before the situation could escalate further. I think we've covered the basic principles pretty well, she announced to the crowd. Multiple opponent scenarios are complex, and the most important thing to understand is that avoidance and escape are usually better options than engagement, but Rodriguez wasn't ready to end the demonstration. Actually, I think we should try one more scenario, he called out, positioning himself for another attack. Something a little more realistic. Sarah felt a familiar chill of recognition. She had been in this situation before, moments when training partners let ego override professionalism and turned educational exercises into personal competitions. Her grandfather Miguel had taught her to recognize these moments early and either de-escalate them or be prepared for what came next. I think we've demonstrated enough for today, Sarah replied firmly, using her command voice from her Marine Corps days. Let's move on to some Q&A about applications.
Instead of backing down, Rodriguez looked at Webb and made a subtle hand signal.
Sarah caught the gesture and immediately understood what was happening. They were planning a coordinated attack, something they had probably practiced together in their unit training. This was no longer a demonstration. It had become a test of her capabilities against their teamwork. The gymnasium fell silent as the tension in the air became palpable. The watching SEALs sensed that something was shifting from educational demonstration to actual confrontation. Commander Richardson started moving toward the mat, clearly planning to intervene before things went too far. "Rodriguez, stand down," Richardson called out sharply. "The demonstration is over." But Rodriguez was already moving. Without warning, he launched himself at Sarah with a tackle attempt from her left side. At the exact same moment, Webb reluctantly followed their pre-planned coordination and attacked from her right side with a grabbing motion toward her arms. What Rodriguez and Webb had planned as their double-kick maneuver was actually a sophisticated pincer attack that they had used successfully in team training exercises. The idea was that one attacker would force the opponent to focus in one direction while the second attacker came from the blind spot. Against most opponents, it was virtually unstoppable. But Sarah Martinez was not most opponents. The moment she saw Rodriguez's initial movement, her mind shifted into the combat mode that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training against multiple attackers. Time seemed to slow down as her brain processed the angles, timing, and physics of the developing situation. Rodriguez's tackle would reach her first, coming from her left at approximately waist level. Webb's grab would follow a split second later, targeting her upper body from the right side. Both men were larger and stronger than her, and if their attack succeeded, they would be able to control and potentially injure her through sheer physical force. Sarah's response was a masterpiece of timing, physics, and years of specialized training. As Rodriguez's tackle reached her, she dropped her center of gravity and pivoted on her left foot. The movement caused Rodriguez to miss his target and overextend his position. At the same moment, she grabbed his extended arm and used his own momentum to redirect him into a throwing technique. But instead of simply throwing Rodriguez away from her, Sarah used his body as a weapon against Webb. The timing had to be perfect. As Webb reached for her from the right side, Sarah completed Rodriguez's throw in a direction that sent him directly into his teammate's attack path. The collision between the two SEALs was spectacular and devastating. Rodriguez, traveling at high speed from Sarah's throw, struck Webb at shin level, just as Webb was committed to his forward attack. The impact was like watching two football players collide during a high-speed play, except that neither man had been prepared for the contact. Webb's legs were swept completely out from under him, and he went down hard, landing awkwardly on his left leg. Rodriguez, who had been thrown with considerable force, landed on top of his teammate in a tangle of limbs and tactical gear. The sound of the impact echoed through the silent gymnasium like a gunshot. What happened next was chaos. Both SEALs were down and clearly injured. Webb was clutching his left leg and grimacing in obvious pain, while Rodriguez was holding his shoulder and trying to sit up. The watching crowd of SEALs rushed forward to help their teammates, while Commander Richardson immediately called for medical personnel. Sarah stood in the center of the mat, breathing hard but uninjured, looking down at the two operators she had just neutralized in a matter of seconds. The entire engagement had lasted less than 10 seconds from start to finish, but the aftermath would last much longer. "Corpsman!" several SEALs shouted simultaneously, using the traditional call for medical assistance. Within minutes, Navy medical personnel were on the scene, assessing the injuries and preparing to transport both men for treatment. The preliminary assessment was serious but not life-threatening. Webb had suffered what appeared to be a broken tibia in his left leg, while Rodriguez had dislocated his shoulder and possibly broken his collarbone. Both injuries would require surgery and months of rehabilitation. As the medical team worked on the injured SEALs, an uncomfortable silence settled over the gymnasium. The demonstration that had started as an educational exercise had ended with two elite operators being seriously injured by a civilian contractor who stood barely over 5 feet tall. Commander Richardson approached Sarah, his expression unreadable. She could see him processing the implications of what had just happened. Two of his SEALs injured during what was supposed to be a routine training demonstration, questions about liability and responsibility, and the inevitable investigation that would follow. "Are you hurt?" was Richardson's first question. "No, sir, I'm fine," Sarah replied, still processing the adrenaline from the confrontation. Richardson nodded, and then asked the question that would shape everything that came next. "Did they attack you, or was this part of the planned demonstration?" Sarah looked at the commander carefully, understanding the weight of her answer. She could see Webb and Rodriguez being loaded onto gurneys, both clearly in significant pain. The watching SEALs were looking at her with a mixture of awe, concern, and uncertainty. "They attacked me," Sarah said quietly but clearly. "I defended myself." The honesty of her response rippled through the crowd. SEALs respected directness above almost everything else, and Sarah's willingness to call the situation what it was, an attack rather than a training accident, immediately established her credibility with the operators who had witnessed it. Petty Officer Chen, who had participated in the earlier demonstration, stepped forward. "She's right, sir." Rodriguez escalated the situation and signaled Webb for a coordinated attack. She told them to stand down, and they attacked anyway. Several other SEALs nodded in agreement, confirming Chen's account of events. It was clear that the watching operators understood exactly what had happened and why Sarah had responded the way she did. As the medical team wheeled Webb and Rodriguez out of the gymnasium, the remaining SEALs began to process what they had just witnessed. They had seen a civilian contractor, a woman weighing less than 140 pounds, neutralize two of their teammates in seconds, using nothing but skill, timing, and leverage. The demonstration had ended far differently than anyone had planned, but it had accomplished something that hours of explanation never could have achieved. Sarah Martinez had proven beyond any doubt that technique and training could overcome size and aggression, even against elite operators who thought they knew better. The hours following the incident moved like a carefully orchestrated military operation. Commander Richardson immediately initiated protocols for training injuries while simultaneously beginning the investigation process that would determine exactly what had happened and whether any disciplinary action was warranted. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being both the star and the subject of intense scrutiny. On one hand, she had demonstrated remarkable skill in neutralizing two attackers without sustaining injury herself. On the other hand, two Navy SEALs were in surgery because of her actions, regardless of the circumstances that had led to those actions. The first order of business was Sarah's formal statement about the incident. She met with Richardson and the base's legal officer to provide a detailed account of everything that had happened from her perspective. Her military background served her well during this process. She knew how to provide clear, factual testimony without speculation or emotional language.
"Walk me through the moment you realized this was no longer a demonstration," the legal officer requested.
Sarah thought carefully before responding. "When Rodriguez made the hand signal to Webb while I was trying to end the exercise. At that point, I knew they were planning a coordinated attack rather than continuing the educational demonstration." "Did you feel you were in danger?" Richardson asked. "Yes, sir. Two operators, each outweighing me by 80 pounds, attacking in coordination with clear intent to prove a point, rather than following safety protocols. In that situation, I had to assume they might not maintain the control necessary to prevent serious injury." The questioning continued for over an hour, covering every detail of the demonstration from setup through aftermath. Sarah answered every question honestly and thoroughly, understanding that her future with the SEAL program, and possibly her entire career as a military contractor, might depend on how this investigation concluded. While Sarah was giving her statement, the SEALs who had witnessed the incident were providing their own accounts. The picture that emerged was remarkably consistent. Rodriguez had escalated the situation against Sarah's attempts to de-escalate, had ignored Richardson's direct order to stand down, and had initiated what was clearly an attack rather than a training exercise. Petty Officer Chen proved to be particularly valuable as a witness. His earlier participation in the demonstration had given him insight into Sarah's teaching methods and safety consciousness. "She was professional throughout the entire presentation," he told investigators. "When Rodriguez started getting aggressive, she tried multiple times to dial things back down. She only responded with force when they actually attacked her." The medical reports from the hospital provided additional context for the investigation. Webb's broken tibia was consistent with a high-impact collision rather than a throwing technique, supporting Sarah's account that the injuries resulted from the two SEALs colliding with each other rather than from her directly injuring them. Rodriguez's shoulder dislocation and broken collarbone were consistent with being thrown forcefully, but not beyond what might be expected in a legitimate self-defense situation. Dr. Amanda Foster, the orthopedic surgeon who treated both men, was asked to provide her professional opinion about the nature of the injuries. Her assessment was enlightening. Both patients sustained injuries that appear to be the result of a collision between the two of them rather than direct assault. The force and angle of impact suggest they were moving toward each other at high speed when they collided. This medical evidence strongly supported Sarah's version of events, that she had used one attacker's momentum to cause him to collide with the other, rather than directly injuring either man through strikes or throws. As word of the incident spread through the SEAL community at Coronado, reactions were mixed but generally supportive of Sarah. The operators who had been present during the demonstration were almost universally impressed with her skills and agreed that Rodriguez had been out of line. However, some SEALs who hadn't witnessed the events were more skeptical about the civilian contractor who had injured two of their brothers. Team Chief Petty Officer Michael Santos, a 15-year SEAL veteran, summed up the prevailing attitude. Nobody likes to see teammates get hurt, but from what I'm hearing, those guys brought it on themselves. You don't attack an instructor during a demonstration and then complain when they defend themselves effectively. The investigation took 3 days to complete, during which Sarah continued her normal duties, but, under heightened scrutiny, she could feel the weight of judgment from various quarters, some supporting her actions, others questioning whether a civilian contractor should be teaching combat techniques to elite military operators at all. On the third day, Commander Richardson called Sarah into his office to discuss the investigation's findings and their implications for her contract. "The good news," Richardson began, "is that the investigation completely exonerates you of any wrongdoing. Every witness confirms that you acted in self-defense after repeatedly attempting to de-escalate the situation. The medical evidence supports your account of events, and there's no question that Rodriguez and Webb initiated an attack against a direct order to stand down." Sarah felt a wave of relief but sensed there was more to come. "The complicated news," Richardson continued, "is that this incident has created some political challenges for the program. Some people higher up the chain are questioning whether having civilian contractors provide combat training to SEALs is appropriate, especially given that this ended with injuries." "What does that mean for my contract?" Sarah asked directly. Richardson smiled slightly. "Actually, it means something quite different than you might expect. The SEAL community has a way of dealing with situations like this. Word of what happened has spread beyond Coronado, and the reaction has been interesting." Over the next hour, Richardson explained how the story of Sarah's demonstration had taken on a life of its own within the Special Operations community. The basic facts. A 5'4" civilian contractor had neutralized 2 attacking SEALs in seconds without sustaining injury, had been shared among operators from various units and branches of service. More importantly, the incident had sparked serious discussions about combat training methodologies and the value of technique-based fighting systems. Several SEAL teams had requested that Sarah provide similar training to their operators, and inquiries had come in from other special operations units as well. "The bottom line," Richardson concluded, "is that you've accomplished something that most contractors can only dream of. You've earned genuine respect from the operators you're teaching. The fact that you could defend yourself against 2 of our people has actually enhanced your credibility rather than diminishing it." That afternoon, Sarah visited Webb and Rodriguez in the hospital. She had been uncertain about whether such a visit would be appropriate, but Richardson had encouraged her to go, believing it would help close the loop on the incident. Webb, who was recovering from surgery to repair his broken leg, was gracious and apologetic about the situation. "I want to apologize for my part in what happened," he said immediately upon seeing Sarah. "Rodriguez convinced me that we were just testing your techniques more realistically, but I should have recognized that he was escalating things inappropriately." "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, genuinely concerned about his condition. "I'll be fine. 6 months of physical therapy and I'll be back to full duty. But I learned something important about respecting safety protocols and recognizing when training is becoming something else." Rodriguez's attitude was quite different. He was still clearly angry about being injured and seemed to blame Sarah for responding too aggressively to what he characterized as a training exercise. However, even Rodriguez admitted that he had ignored Richardson's order to stand down and had initiated physical contact against Sarah's explicit attempts to end the demonstration. "I still think you overreacted," Rodriguez said, though without the hostility Sarah had expected. "I defended myself against what I perceived as an attack by 2 larger opponents," Sarah replied calmly. "Given the speed and coordination of your actions, I had to assume you were both fully committed to the engagement and respond accordingly." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I guess I understand that. I've been thinking about it for 3 days, and I can see how it looked from your perspective. I just got caught up in trying to prove a point instead of focusing on the training." The hospital visits provided an important closure to the incident. Both injured SEALs accepted responsibility for their roles in escalating the situation, and both expressed respect for Sarah's skills and her professionalism in handling the aftermath. When Sarah returned to Coronado the next day, she found that her status within the SEAL community had fundamentally changed. Instead of being viewed as an outsider trying to prove herself, she was now seen as someone who had already proven herself in the most definitive way possible, through actual combat effectiveness. The transformation was evident in countless small ways. SEALs who had previously been polite but distant now sought her out for conversations about fighting techniques and training methodologies. Operators who had questioned her credentials were now asking her to work with their teams on specific skills development. Most importantly, the quality of her training sessions improved dramatically. Instead of having to convince SEALs that her techniques were worth learning, She now found herself working with operators who were genuinely eager to understand and master the methods she was teaching. Petty Officer Chen captured the change perfectly. Before, we listened to you because we were supposed to. Now we listen to you because we know what you're capable of. That makes all the difference in the world. 6 months after the incident that would become known throughout the special operations community as the demonstration, Sarah Martinez had become one of the most sought-after combat instructors in the military. Her reputation had spread far beyond Coronado, reaching special operations units across all branches of the armed forces. The story of how she had neutralized 2 attacking SEALs in 17 seconds had taken on mythical proportions as it was retold throughout military circles. Each retelling seemed to add new details or emphasize different aspects of the encounter, but the core message remained consistent. Technique and training could overcome size and aggression when applied by someone who truly understood combat dynamics. Rodriguez and Webb both returned to full duty after their recovery periods, and both became advocates for Sarah's training methods. Their experience of being on the receiving end of her techniques had given them unique insight into their effectiveness, and they often spoke about the incident as a learning experience rather than a defeat. "It completely changed how I think about fighting," Webb explained to his teammates during a training session. "I always assumed that if I was bigger and stronger, I had the advantage. Sarah showed me that advantages only matter if you know how to use them and if your opponent doesn't know how to neutralize them." Rodriguez's transformation was even more dramatic. The ego and aggression that had led to the confrontation were replaced by a genuine appreciation for the mental aspects of combat that Sarah emphasized in her training. He became one of her most dedicated students, often staying after formal training sessions to practice techniques and ask questions about applications. "The thing about Martinez," Rodriguez told new SEAL candidates during orientation sessions, "is that she doesn't just teach you how to fight. She teaches you how to think about fighting." That's the difference between someone who wins fights and someone who never has to fight at all. The success of Sarah's program at Coronado led to expansion opportunities that she had never anticipated. The Army Special Forces Command requested that she develop similar training curricula for their operators. The Marine Corps, her former branch, asked her to return as a senior instructor at their combat training center. Even the Air Force's Special Operations Command inquired about having her train their pararescue personnel. Each new assignment brought unique challenges and learning opportunities. Special Forces operators had different backgrounds and mission requirements than SEALs, which forced Sarah to adapt her teaching methods and technique selections. Marine Corps students brought their own cultural expectations and training traditions that had to be respected while still introducing new concepts. But perhaps the most significant development was the attention Sarah's story attracted from civilian law enforcement agencies. Police departments dealing with officers who were smaller in stature or facing budget constraints that limited the size of their personnel were particularly interested in training that emphasized technique over strength. Detective Maria Vasquez of the Los Angeles Police Department attended one of Sarah's civilian seminars and later credited the training with saving her life during a confrontation with a much larger suspect. "I kept hearing Sarah's voice in my head," Vasquez recounted. "She always said that the biggest guy in the fight is usually the most surprised when his size doesn't matter." The incident at Coronado had also sparked broader conversations within military training communities about the integration of different fighting disciplines and the value of diverse perspectives in combat instruction. Several research studies were initiated to examine the effectiveness of technique-based training compared to traditional strength and conditioning approaches. Dr. James Mitchell, a sports psychology researcher who studied the effectiveness of Sarah's methods, published findings that supported many of her core principles. "What Martinez demonstrates," Mitchell wrote, "is that combat effectiveness is more about cognitive processing speed and technique precision than physical attributes. Her students consistently outperform larger opponents in controlled scenarios because they've learned to think faster and move more efficiently." These research findings help legitimize Sarah's methods within academic and military communities that had historically been skeptical of fighting systems that didn't emphasize physical conditioning above all else. The data provided scientific backing for what operators who had trained with Sarah already knew through experience. As Sarah's reputation grew, she also began receiving invitations to speak at military academies, law enforcement conferences, and martial arts symposiums. These speaking engagements allowed her to share not just techniques but the philosophy behind effective combat training. The goal, Sarah would tell audiences, is not to create fighters who can overpower any opponent. The goal is to create intelligent combatants who can solve problems under pressure using whatever tools and advantages they have available. One of her most memorable speaking appearances was at the Naval Academy, where she addressed a mixed audience of midshipmen, faculty, and visiting military personnel. During the question and answer period, a midshipman asked her about the psychological aspects of facing larger opponents. Sarah's response became one of her most quoted statements. Fear of larger opponents is really fear of your own limitations. Once you understand that size is just one variable in a complex equation, you stop being intimidated by physical differences and start looking for the advantages you do have. The midshipman who asked the question was Jessica Park, who would later become one of the first female naval aviators to qualify for combat missions. Park credited Sarah's words with helping her overcome doubts about competing in traditionally male-dominated fields. Meanwhile, back at Coronado, Sarah's training program had become a model for other military installations. The combination of practical technique instruction, tactical application scenarios, and emphasis on mental preparation was being replicated at bases around the world. Commander Richardson, who had initially been nervous about bringing a civilian contractor into the SEAL training environment, became one of Sarah's strongest advocates within the Navy hierarchy. His reports about the program's success led to Sarah being offered a permanent position as a senior instructor, making her one of the few civilians ever to hold such a role within the SEAL community. The incident that could have ended her career here instead established her as an irreplaceable asset, Richardson wrote in his recommendation for Sarah's permanent appointment. Her ability to command respect from our operators while teaching them genuinely valuable skills makes her exactly the kind of instructor we need. The offer of permanent employment forced Sarah to make a difficult decision about her future. Accepting the position would provide security and the opportunity to continue developing her training programs within one of the world's most elite military organizations. However, it would also limit her ability to work with other units and expand her influence across the broader military community. After consulting with her grandfather Miguel, who was now in his late 70s but still providing wisdom and guidance, Sarah decided to decline the permanent position in favor of maintaining her contractor status. This decision allowed her to continue working with multiple military branches while developing new programs and applications for her training methods. My goal was never to become part of one organization, Sarah explained to Richardson. My goal is to change how we think about combat training across all organizations. I can have more impact by maintaining the flexibility to work wherever the need is greatest. 3 years after the demonstration at Coronado, Sarah's influence on military combat training was undeniable. Her techniques were being taught at installations around the world. Her philosophy was being incorporated into official training manuals, and a new generation of instructors was carrying forward her methods. The two SEALs whose attack had started it all remained in contact with Sarah and often assisted with her training programs. Their perspective as students who had experienced her techniques firsthand made them valuable teaching assistants and credible advocates for her methods. People ask us if we're embarrassed about what happened, Webb said during a joint presentation with Sarah at a special operations conference. The answer is that we're embarrassed about our behavior leading up to it, but we're proud of what we learned from it. Sometimes the best lessons come from the most humbling experiences, Rodriguez added. Sarah didn't just defend herself that day. She showed all of us that our assumptions about combat effectiveness were limiting our potential as operators. That lesson has made all of us better at our jobs. The story of Sarah Martinez and her 17-second demonstration continued to inspire military personnel, law enforcement officers, and civilian practitioners around the world. But for Sarah herself, the incident had become just one chapter in an ongoing mission to improve how people prepared for and dealt with physical confrontations. The demonstration at Coronado wasn't about proving anything to anyone, Sarah reflected during an interview several years later. It was about staying true to the principles I learned from my grandfather and the training I received throughout my career. Sometimes doing the right thing requires decisive action, even when that action has consequences you didn't anticipate. When asked about her legacy and what she hoped to accomplish through her continued work, Sarah's answer reflected the same practical wisdom that had guided her throughout her career. I want people to understand that they're capable of more than they think they are. Size, strength, and aggression matter less than preparation, technique, and the willingness to act decisively when action is required. If I can teach people those lessons, then everything else, including what happened at Coronado, will have been worthwhile. The gymnasium at Coronado Naval Base where the demonstration took place was eventually renamed the Martinez Training Center in recognition of Sarah's contributions to SEAL training programs. A plaque near the entrance reads, "Dedicated to the principle that excellence in combat comes from the marriage of physical skill and mental preparation." Sarah attended the dedication ceremony, accompanied by Miguel, who was now using a wheelchair but remained as sharp and proud as ever. As they stood together looking at the plaque, Miguel placed his weathered hand on Sarah's shoulder and repeated the words he had spoken to her so many years earlier in his garage. Strength isn't about how big your muscles are, Mija. It's about how fast your mind moves and how precise your actions are. Those words, which had shaped a young girl growing up in East Los Angeles, had ultimately transformed military combat training around the world. The legacy of 17 seconds in a Navy SEAL training facility would continue influencing how warriors prepared for battle for generations to come.